Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I'm here to tell you about a part of my dissertation project and what I learned with and from my students when we engaged to our community-engaged language learning partnership program. And later, some of them chose to participate in my research project about it. So I'll start by telling you about myself, the program, my students. I try to call them my interlocutors, but it's hard sometimes because they spent a school year as my students. But do not be fooled by that. I do see them very much as co-theorizers. Two of them have become my co-authors, 𝘊𝘠𝘂𝙗 and 𝘊𝘂𝘠𝘂, and I'll mention them quite a bit today because a lot of the analysis presented today owes to them, and we actually recently presented part of this in a conference together. But moving on, I will tell you about my pedagogical and research design. I'll discuss sense of knowledge and how I engage with that concept, and then I'll present some of my findings. So since in the program we talk a lot about horizontal learning, I want to hear from you. This is recorded, but maybe you can write in the chat any responses you might have. So just watch this video and share anything you notice with us. And I'll give you a second for you to do that. So if you have additional thoughts, please continue posting into the chat. But one thing I love about walking into a conversation club is that it's very loud and cheerful because we try to keep the spaces as informal as possible. Our intent is to lower people's affective filter, making them comfortable to practice with us. And I would say we're also modeling a different form of sociability in a country where we are not always welcoming of immigrants and we're not always patient with people who have accents. And now I'm going to borrow the words of my co-author, 𝘊𝘂𝘂𝙗, to describe what we do. New Brunswick has a strong immigrant community, primarily Latinx from Mexico and the Dominican Republic, but also from Ukraine, Turkey, China, etc. Often, these communities are linguistically isolated, and participants report not regularly having the opportunity to practice English. Here, you can see how our conversation clubs are structured to respond to this. Rather than the traditional one-way communication between one teacher and several students, we had an ethnically and age-diverse mix of expert English speakers and English language learners, or ELLs, at each table, practicing activities and learning from one another. Now, this is me. I am a doctoral student in the Department of Education at Rutgers. I taught the community-engaged language education, or CLE course, for 4 years. And in the last year, when this cohort I worked with here was in the program, I had the opportunity to also teach the second semester, or CLE leadership, which honor students usually go to complete their capstone with us. So in this case, everyone in the CLE cohort was an honor student, so they all went on to do CLE leadership, and I was their de facto capstone essay advisor because the honors departments were a bit understaffed at the time at Rutgers. So my students are amazing. Almost everyone was either first or second gen. Second gen was most predominant. Among my research interlocutors, they were almost 75%. The total cohort had 23 students, 15 joined as participants. In terms of procedures, a number of them agreed to join with my advisor, Mary Karen, in early spring or our second semester together. So from then on, I collected field notes more formally. And after the end of the semester, I got access to the list of those who had agreed. And I reached out and they chose to participate in either a focus group, an interview, or both. But back to the graphic, as you can see, the majority of the cohort was South Asian, which reflects to a great extent the demographic at Rutgers and some of the area. One thing that does not reflect the demographic of New Brunswick specifically, which is the town that hosts our campus, is that I only had one Latino student, whereas Latinos make up about half of New Brunswick's population. But that's another very interesting conversation that I'm not going to get into right now. You can also see that 3 interlocutors were from the former Soviet Union, and I'm calling it that because their parents came around the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and because of that, they all spoke Russian at home. You can see we have 7 different home languages here. They would go up to 11 if I consider dialects, and also languages and dialects that were not spoken at home, but were part of students' heritage, like Punjabi or Paswari for the students' experience came from Pakistan. One interesting hidden language that's not in the chart is Ukrainian, which was being reclaimed and learned by a student called �々𝘂𝑗. And she was very proud of speaking Russian, But given the current state of her country, she wanted to reconnect with this aspect of her heritage and affirm herself as Ukrainian and not just Russian speaking. So this is basically my claim here. This project has proven to be very multidimensional and complex, and things have many interconnected layers. So to write or present, I need to work really hard to say something specific, but I'm happy to engage with different dimensions that you're curious about during Q&A, or if anyone wants to say dialogue after this. That said, the argument here is that informed by their background and upbringing, students had a spoken openness to asset-based approaches, but still having the experience to talk to other people, to engage with them in a continuous manner and converse, and at the same time, learn concepts and reflect with their colleagues, the students were able to give their intuition a deeper substance and concreteness. And then the third part of the article, as you can see, is less developed and fleshed out, but even though I've engaged with some of these concepts for many years, the students really complexified my understanding of them. So there's this third level of engaging with what I've learned. So this project involved an ethnographic pedagogy throughout the year of teaching this cohort. After the end of the academic year, I conducted the focus groups and interviews. The students who participated in the interviews and focus groups also agreed for me to use all the course assignments and field notes I collected. For my co-theorizing with Raghav and Ursula, I shared parts of the data too and parts of my emerging analysis, and we had a couple of reflection sessions and some asynchronous discussion of this data and this analysis. The question on the top of the screen here is the one guiding this dissertation project, which is made of 3 articles. So the 2 questions on the bottom are guiding one of those articles, of which this presentation is a part of. The last question is really what I'll focus on mostly today. What can immigrant students learn through extended interactions with immigrant community members? I'm not even going to get much into the organization side of it. So funds of knowledge. In a very rough summary of the literature, funds of knowledge starts from Mexican immigrant families on both sides of the border and highlighting their resourcefulness to try to counter deficit-based approaches. From there, there's an expansion both in terms of who are the research subjects, but also a growing attention to other forms of collectivity beyond the family. And even though the concept has many scholarly and practical ramifications, there's still little work on higher education and particularly on curricular applications. The funds of identity intervention brings in a focus on self-definition, expression, awareness, and using funds of knowledge as a resource that can be identified and elaborated by students. The funds of identity side of the literature actually has more curricular applications in higher education settings. And I engage with that a little more in a different paper, but it is adjacent to what I'm discussing here. But here, pedagogically, I'm basically thinking about the importance and the possibility of welcoming students in their wholeness into our classrooms, learning about different aspects of their identity. Here, because we work with immigrant communities and to challenge deficit-based approaches to them, the part of students' identity that became very prominent was their immigrant identities. So this is also part of my conceptual framework, and it's very much emic in the sense that I built this understanding in dialogue with my students, but it's also eidetic because I was the one generally introducing conceptual lenses, and then the students chose to be more interested in certain ones than others. But what was really emic was this perception I gained over the semester engaging with them that students had an intuition and unspoken openness to asset-based approaches. And at different points, I've shared this feeling with them. And I particularly discussed it in depth with my co-authors, Ursula and Raghav. So these are some aspects of what the program facilitates. So on this side, the extended interaction that allows students to humanize their knowledge, expand their repertoires of life stories they know, and also practice leveraging assets in the context of language learning. And on this side, the scaffolded reflection opportunities that I facilitated supported the students in going through a praxis that allowed them to refine their initial intuitions and what they were interested in, and build social critiques throughout the year, but specifically through their capstone essay. And ta-da, this is the last crazy diagram I'll show you today, but this particular one owes a lot to Ursula and her question in one of our data analysis section. Could it be that what makes asset-based approaches intuitively understandable to us is the fact that we have experienced power differentials in our lives? So one could call them minoritization experiences, and not every student in this cohort reported being or feeling minoritized, but a majority of students have either experienced it directly or through their parents and elders. In some cases, when we came to the US, in some cases in their home country, which is Ursula's case, her grandfather had to escape Indian Punjab as a Muslim boy during partition and lost his father in the process. And now Ursula's career goal, she's a medical student, but her goal is to work with displaced populations. So she's a prime example of someone who has been minoritized indirectly, sort of channeling that into challenging status quo, into questioning status quo, which, to be clear, was not a result of the program. She already had that goal before, but she definitely deepened and refined her social critiques in ways that deeply impressed me. So clearly, I've been touching on my findings, but now I wanted to take a second with you to look at some excerpts, and I'm also going to read some part of my article. The CLE curriculum makes for a tight schedule in our first semester together. It includes language facilitation strategies and conceptual lenses, along with an embedded community engagement forum. Still, in the first 3 weeks of the semester, we spend significant time getting to know each other, building community and making connections. For instance, on week 1, we go around introducing ourselves, sharing our majors, career goals, motivations to join the program, and cultural and linguistic backgrounds. With this cohort, we also sat in a circle with a large piece of paper in the middle and asked each other questions seeking to find commonalities. For each commonality we found, we drew a line between the people that shared it. For instance, Victoria and I drew a line connecting us because of our shared Latin American background. I also drew lines between myself and students on commonalities as lighthearted as liking crappy reality TV and as heavy as having familial histories impacted by genocide. According to Elliot and Vijaya, having an instructor who wants to get to know them is a rare experience in college. Furthermore, Elliot shared rarely having opportunities to connect with colleagues, even as he has advanced through his mathematics coursework and the class sizes were reduced. Notably, he brought up our introductory exercises in both of his end of semester essays, as well as during our individual and group dialogues. Given his major, his commuter status, and the experience of attending college during a pandemic, Elliot assigned high significance to getting to know others in our budding classroom learning community. Additionally, as students shared their cultural and linguistic backgrounds, Elliot, like many of his colleagues and myself, appreciated encountering a shared immigrant background. Now, here I'm going to borrow Ursula's words again from our presentation together. Here are 2 quotes that describe opinions that many of our classmates shared while learning about funds of knowledge. As stated previously, almost everyone in our class was first or second gen. The idea that people who do not speak English are not intellectually lacking and have a wide range of backgrounds and skills to offer was not new for many of us. Some of us thought that even having to dedicate so much literature to it was unnecessary. Our own life experiences, either having parents who were ELLs or being ELLs ourselves, had made essay-based thinking a natural way of thinking for us, and we were, quote, almost always practicing it. Now here we're getting more to what was facilitated through extended interaction. And Amara is talking about the sense of over time learning about participants and their strengths. Like this participant who is from Haiti. He had lived in 2 different countries and had learned 2 different languages and cultures before coming to the US. In a different session, when we were talking about professions, 3 other facilitators got stuck for a second working with him when they asked him what he did for work because he was unemployed at the moment. But after sharing more examples, the facilitator shared more examples, asked more questions, they learned that he was very experienced in 2 or 3 different blue-collar occupations from his experience of immigrating repeatedly and working in different countries. So that allowed them to converse with him and give him tools to talk about the things he was good at. So through our praxis, students challenge mainstream narratives about immigrant communities by understanding the nuances within immigrant experience, humanizing and assigning names and faces to what they already knew, and situating what is true about those narratives within a structural understanding of social conditions. For instance, many students brought up the nuances of educational attainment and how many of our participants, as well as their relatives, were highly skilled professionals who at times could not practice their professions because of these limitations. There's people who are lawyers or doctors or whatever in their home countries. But over here, what I think the stereotype is a lot for Latinos is we think partners, we think maids, we think, very unskilled labor sort of jobs. So you see the disconnect. Beyond identifying this disconnect, Victoria went on to identify the social conditions that shape the fact that indeed many Latinos in the US took on unskilled jobs. Given the difficulty of legal migration for Latin Americans and the predominance of unskilled labor for undocumented folks, many would pursue jobs that disregarded their skills. So I think once we start to understand funds of knowledge and what a lot of these people are actually capable of, Once we see like the gap in what's actually happening, we can start to think about broader issues. Amina responded to her by acknowledging social conditions in the case of people who do not have a traditional educational background. Perhaps they had to cut their education short because they had to get a job to make money for the family, or they had to take care of someone at home. She went on to highlight that the forms of knowledge that those participants had should not be disregarded. Finally, the extended interaction also provided opportunities for students who were aiming for public-facing professions to exercise their ability and stamina to engage with adults in general, and particularly those whose primary language is not English. Some students reflected upon their role in supporting their peers and also being more cognizant of how to engage with immigrant patients. Amina and Scott, who are pursuing healthcare careers, felt like they gained more confidence to engage with adults. We were uncomfortable speaking with adults. I guess we just didn't want to disrespect them or be patronizing. Usually the adult is the instructor or the teacher or the mentor, and so since the roles were reversed, I didn't know how to approach that situation. For Amina, the confidence gain already bears fruit in her role as a volunteer EMT. Being assigned to lead her team whose members were older than her, Amina was nervous but realized that she had the confidence and practice to take on the role with a professional attitude. Additionally, when faced with language barriers with patients, Amina has been able to hone in her skills as well as invite bilingual colleagues to do the same. Anadia had already had service experiences with adults whose first language was not English. Still, the continued engagement facilitated through the program allowed her, in her words, to gain stamina over the course of the year. Interestingly, Anadia discusses the stamina not only to interact, but to keep track of power differentials and what behaviors can become harmful to participants. Her advice to other medical students was to mind what you're saying and to consider the lasting impact that our actions and words can have in reinforcing our position over someone or making someone feel less than. As demonstrated, students drew from their backgrounds, funds of knowledge, and immigrant identities to understand, apply, and analyze the framework that grounded this program. That was facilitated through a classroom learning community that welcomed them as whole beings and valued their cultural and linguistic background and assets. Importantly, extended exposure to others in a setting where you were mostly responsible for conversing was very powerful. Additionally, scaffolded opportunities for reflection allowed for students to make connections and deepen them throughout their learning program. They deeply analyzed themselves, values, and understandings in tandem with the experience they were having in the program. That allowed them to strengthen their understanding of our frameworks and accumulate and practice mobilizing the language and the examples that demonstrate their views and hopefully enable them to advocate for that in their future lives and professions. Now, a limitation that was also pointed out by Ursula is that even though many students appreciated having lots of peers who had similar experiences, we were not exercising our ability to advocate and engage with people who are not like-minded, and that we might taking it for granted that we have a certain kind of lenses. And as I was talking about this data and starting to work with Ursula and Raghav in our shared presentation, Ursula posed the question of reinventing the curriculum to better serve immigrant students. How can we invite them to take steps further into different reflections? So I'm curious on their thoughts of how we can reinvent the curriculum to better serve immigrant students in the program. But my initial response to this data was to say, well, why can't immigrant students be in leadership positions and model or demonstrate what an asset-based approach is to other students? But that raised the question of having immigrant students, who are often students of color, being burdened with the responsibility of educating white students or students with an assimilated immigrant background. And then Raghav reminded us that we're there to learn together, not to teach. So we brainstormed some more horizontal ways to facilitate learning. And Ursula's intervention was that more than intuitively understanding asset-based approaches, what is easier for immigrant students to understand is what it is to be minoritized. So from the understanding that a non-minority student cannot know what it is to be minoritized, we reflected on how to raise their awareness. We talked so far about sharing some real life scenarios, or first-hand accounts of people experiencing power imbalances, and discussing the language ideologies that make people from speaking. These are the references quoted and key funds of knowledge references, and thank you so much for taking the time.